On your first reading of Chapter 10, you may get the idea that the bigger hammer action is very, very useful on a certain category of images, but that category of images doesn't show up very often. And that is sort of the way it was a few years ago when that action was first introduced. It's really good if you have the kind of picture that absolutely depends upon highlight detail or absolutely depends on shadow detail. Pictures of waterfalls, pictures of snowstorms, pictures of polar bears, things where you've absolutely got to have as much detail as possible in these light areas. Those are the classic pictures for the bigger hammer, but of course they don't show up all that often. Also, you will note that all these things I just mentioned tend to be white, not some specific color. Okay. If you limit yourself to these things, then, you'll still get some good use out of the bigger hammer, but the bigger hammer is now a lot more useful than it used to be because of some changes that we've made in the PPW panel in the options window for the bigger hammer action. And I'd like to show you some examples of what you should be thinking about there. Okay, let me start off with this just to remind you of what the sort of classic picture for bigger hammer would be. We're hard up for highlight detail in the background in the snow. Certainly would seem like we would want to have some more interesting clouds than we do have here, and the foreground detail is too heavy in the shadows. So I'm just thinking that if you click the bigger hammer, we get a better image right away, and that seems to be true. Without it and with it, or without it, with it. Okay. If you think that's too much, you can of course reduce the opacity or do any one of a number of other things. This, like the other images that I've mentioned, is basically neutral. You're trying to improve whites. Okay. Now, supposing that what you're trying to improve is light, but it has a color. For example, faces. Is this the sort of image for the bigger hammer? Let's find out. Perhaps not. But then again, perhaps yes. This definitely was a failure, what I just did, but it's a failure because of the way that the bigger hammer is constructed by default. It uses an inverted blurred copy of the red channel as the overlaying layer. In fact, you'll notice it says that here. How very convenient. It says it's the red. And the red is very light in faces, and so the overlay darkens these faces, and it darkens them way excessively. So this is certainly not usable. But you wonder what would happen if you used some other channel as the inverted overlay. Now, I do wonder that, but I don't wonder it enough to start horsing around by loading another layer, blurring it, trying a whole bunch of different stuff, totally as a flyer, not knowing whether it's going to work or not. But what we have now, we know what doesn't work, but we can go cancel the action. Okay, we're back to where we started from. And now we can go to this new bigger hammer options window. And to do that, I'm going to, instead of just click, I'm option clicking. All right, and this has, we're now back where I showed you, the unacceptable version, using the red channel as the overlay. But if we use a channel that's darker in the faces than the overlay, as the overlay than the red is, then we might get a better result. And you see what this option window does for us. It allows us to choose one of 5 different channels as the overlay. The red, the green, the blue, or the RGB, or the RGB converted to grayscale. Okay? And it's got a couple of other actions down here that we can play with, and it lets us adjust the blur radius. Okay, my first thought here would be, well, the red is certainly going to be the wrong thing for faces. So I'd be wondering what the blue would do, because the blue is going to be the darkest one in the faces. The faces are kind of yellow. So let's preview what happens if I click blue here. Well, that's a good deal more interesting now, isn't it? Okay, let's turn the preview off to see what happened. There's before we ran the action. There's after. Okay, now is this the right thing? I don't know. Maybe we want a little bit of it. It seems to be opening up a little bit of the hair. It seems like the faces may be a little bit more attractive. I might go with this in maybe at a lower opacity. I notice also that the woman's shirt here has gotten better, because that's sort of a classic target for bigger hammer. That's nice. So this certainly has promise, as opposed to using the red, which was a disaster. Using the green might even be better than this. Okay, that's what happens if you use the green. And you can try the others as well. I mean, the RGB desaturated, the RGB grayscale, is often a fairly conservative move. I don't know, I sort of prefer the green myself as a starting point. We have a couple of other options also that we can fool around with. One of them is to emphasize what's happening in the shadows rather than in the highlights, like that. I mean, if we do that, well, there's some good stuff going on. I'd reduce the opacity of it, though. We can also retain the original color, because the action itself is sort of a color boost action in and of itself, and maybe we want to avoid some of that by going back to the original color. That's a pretty subtle change. There's before, there's after, but you can see that it's keeping the neck a little bit more gray than running the action directly was. So that seems to work, right? And so I'm going to click OK right now. Well, no, I want to do one more thing. I'll demonstrate that the blur radius can affect things as well. So here's the blur radius. And if we change that, yeah, the impact of the action changes too. Let's see if I go way out. Now there's a big change. And here it's a little bit less pronounced. Okay, so let's say that I've decided that this is all right. All this stuff down here, this changes defaults. I don't want to do that, but if you feel like changing your defaults, you can. Like, for example, if you typically work on much bigger pictures than this, you probably need a bigger blur radius. But anyhow, right now I'm going to click OK. And now we have the overlay layer now says that it's green, which is nice. Okay, this is without the bigger hammer action, and this is with choosing the green channel as what our base is for the overlay. And I'm not sure I'd even reduce the opacity of this at all, because it seems to be doing a lot of good things. The hair is nicer, the shirt is nicer, and for me, the skin tone is adequate as well. So here's something where we discovered that the bigger hammer actually is useful, and you wouldn't want to have to experiment with this by hand. You need something like the options window to do it for you. Okay? And sometimes this is hard to predict. Like here, we have another picture in which faces occur in the background. So I would think that we'd have to go to the options window to go to something like the green channel. I would think that, but look at this, even the red's not so bad. So I might not waste the time. Okay, there's before, there's after. And you see how this is making a more interesting picture out of this by exaggerating the highlight detail in the background, even though it's out of focus, and it's picking up detail here in the shadows. So this might be worth dealing with in a picture like this, and it's boosting all the reds here in the shirts and stuff. So that's a nice move. Okay, here we have advertising for real estate for sale. Pretty boring picture. Is it possible that the bigger hammer might help this? The lake, I mean, that's an important part of the picture. It'd be nice to boost it, I suppose. The sign, well, I mean, it's just a sign. I don't see why it would want any more detail. What happens if we run the default? Not very much of interest. The background gets lighter. The lake really doesn't change at all. Okay, but that's using the red channel as an overlay, and the red is probably more or less a mid-tone in the lake. I mean, if the red is halfway dark, that's going to contribute a cyan component to the picture. So the red channel is pretty dark in a blue lake, just like it's fairly light in a person's face. So I wonder if this would be better if we canceled it and tried the blue as the overlay. Because in a lake like this, which is blue, the blue channel is going to be fairly light. So option click on the bigger hammer, and we get this. This is with the red, and let's give the blue a shot. Wham! Big difference. Of course, we wouldn't want that much of it. We might reduce the opacity, but the idea there is a good one. Or we might try the green, I don't know, or the RGB grayscale. That didn't seem to work out too well. So you could go with the blue. Do we want to retain the original color? Yes. That's too brilliant. I'd rather get a better color out of MMM plus color boost. Different radius? Maybe so. That's a really big radius. The problem with the radius that we had here was there's a little bit of haloing around the sign. Going with a bigger radius still accentuates the water, but you can't see a halo as such. Okay, before, after. I'm going to click OK, and what else? The darkening layer, I'd move it up. I'd increase the opacity of the darkening layer because the shadows in the background are not very important. Only the lake is important as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going to darken the background like that, and now decide on something a little bit softer, just reducing the opacity of the overlaying layer. And this is before and this is after. So it looks to me like the bigger hammer did a nice job here. And it'll be even nicer if we flatten it and do something and select part of the lake, so we're going to get variation in it. Run this action. Okay, there's quite a bit of action now in the lake. Something like that. That for a little bit more color. And these steps, the bigger hammer plus the MMM plus color boost, have made quite an exciting picture out of something that was very boring to begin with in the first place. Okay, another example. This is for a magazine that specializes in wood. So it's for people who make wooden furniture. So the star of the show here is this piece. It's not the furniture back here. It's this wood, and we'd like to get a little bit more grain in it. What's the best way? Probably the bigger hammer, but it's not clear which channel we should use. So option click. This is the red. This is the green. Let's compare those again. Here's the red. Okay, the red may be better because it's allowing the red parts of the top of the table to get darker, which plays off nicely against the grain of the wood. The wood grain isn't any different here, but the table isn't quite as nice. Okay, let's try the blue. And the blue is worse than any of them. Okay, I don't think the RGB is a help. So I'm thinking the red was the right way to go. Do we want to increase the radius? No, that did not help the wood grain. Do we want to reduce the radius? Yes. That smaller radius of 19 seems to have better grain than if we use the default, which was about that. Or at least to me it seems that way. So this would be it. And there's before and there's after. And you can see how this is getting us the sort of thing that we wanted in the wood itself without messing up the rest of the picture. The only question is whether you really like what it's doing to the top of the table. But it's quite a creative tool, this options window. Okay, so that, I'll even give one more example of how you could use it creatively. This is a worse picture, but it's a more important one. It's a forensic picture. Okay, here we have a fingerprint, and this fingerprint was not dipped in red paint. It was some other substance. So we would like to have a little better impression of what this is, or rather the police would. So we would process this in a variety of different ways, trying to see how we could get more detail. And one of the ways I'd try is with a bigger hammer. I would think the red channel would be pretty good with it, but I'd try several things. Okay, the red channel. There's the green. That's almost as good. The blue, not so good. The RGB composite seems to bring out a little bit of detail. Let's go back to the red. Yeah, it has something. Let's see if the blur radius does anything for us. That seems to reduce detail. And I'm not getting much of a change over here. But there's that. Here's before, here's after. And there's something to be said for this, because we can always come up here. Let's do this darkening layer. Let's see if that helps us. Not particularly. But we could always add an adjustment layer. Do something like that. And now we're really starting to get pretty good definition. That was not there to begin with. And it was all really, or most of this is due to the bigger hammer, believe it or not, because that was the original. And so those two steps have gotten us to here, which is a good way to enhance this particular fingerprint. Okay, so that's a quick rundown of what you can do with the bigger hammer options window and how it can extend the use of the bigger hammer to a much bigger category of images than you would think just by looking at Chapter 10.